Kia ora koutou, haere mai, and thank you for joining us today for our exclusive one-off webinar live from the field, Your Impact in Ukraine. My name is Amy Richardson. I'm the Communications Director for Save the Children New Zealand and will be facilitating today's webinar. A special welcome to our guests, Save the Children's Eastern Europe Director, Irina Saghoyan, and Heidi Coetzee, Save the Children New Zealand's Chief Executive. We also have a special message from the field from Rachel Cummings, who is the Director of Save the Children's Humanitarian Public Health Team, who is leading our health response in Ukraine and had hoped to join us today, but unfortunately is very busy at the moment. So welcome to everyone. Welcome to you at home in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia. During the session, if you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, which we'll be monitoring during the session. We may not get through all of the questions, but we will be responding to you all afterwards. So if we don't get to your question tonight, we'll be sending out an email and can answer some of those questions there. Shortly, we'll hear from Irina about the current situation in Ukraine and neighbouring countries and how we're responding in the midst of this conflict. Irina is working at the very heart of this emergency, and we're extremely grateful that she has taken time out of her schedule to report back to us here in the Southern Hemisphere. Thank you, Irina. As we know, the scale of the emergency in Ukraine is unlike anything we've seen before. Millions of families have been forced to leave their homes, seeking refuge in neighbouring countries. Children are on the move across Eastern Europe, and they are at risk of hunger, illness, trafficking, and abuse. These children have experienced things no child should ever be exposed to. Let's begin with this short clip to get a sense of what is happening on the ground.
Behind me is what we call a child-friendly space, which is a warm, welcoming environment where children can play and just be children again and start to recover from what they've been through. I was in a child-friendly space and a mum was telling me that she and her two daughters had hidden in their basement for 6 days while their town was bombarded. Children are incredibly resilient and they can bounce back from so much, but they need help. And that's why we're scaling up rapidly across the region to make sure that more and more children get the kind of emotional support that they need to recover.
I am here with Save the Children at the Suret border in northern Romania. We are preparing to send essential food supplies to our partners in Ukraine. We'll be distributing them to children and families who urgently need them. It's only possible because of you, so thank you for standing with children and families in Ukraine.
Thank you so much for that. It gives us a little context of the situation for children in Ukraine, but I'd like to begin the first part of our Q&A session with you, Irina, about the situation in Ukraine at the moment. So what is the current situation for children in Ukraine right now? And what are some of the issues that children are facing?
Thank you very much, Amy, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me in this important webinar. Thanks for showing the video. Every time I see it, I become really emotional. We have been working in Ukraine even prior to the military escalation as of February 24, but what we have seen in the past 8 weeks is just staggering. Honestly, the scale of the atrocities across the country is nothing that we've seen before. And there are a number of issues facing by children and their families in the communities that have been affected by aerial and ground shelling. We see the destruction, high level of destruction, as you could see from the video, and I'm sure people are following the media reports as well. The markets are distracted. There is lack of access to very basics like food, water. Children and their families who are hiding in the bomb shelters are deprived from anything. They are deprived from very basics, as well as cannot even go out to get some fresh air for days and weeks. I remember in early days, there was a WhatsApp message sent by one of the girls who was involved in the past in Save the Children programs in Eastern Ukraine. And she was reporting from the place she was in a small village that was impacted by heavy shelling, and her family and herself were hiding in the bomb shelter, underground shelter for 3 days without knowing what's happening in the next house where her grandparents lived. The communication was disrupted. Her voice was really emotional. She was almost crying because you can imagine for a 15-year-old girl witnessing such violence and atrocities is just awful. And most importantly, they don't really know when this will end. So there is no hope for children and for teenagers to understand when they can get back to the sense of normality. This will inevitably and is leaving inevitably the heavy impact on the psychosocial condition of these children. Children are scared, they are terrified, they are traumatized, and even though organizations like Save the Children and others are doing their best to provide psychosocial support, I believe that the impact of this violence may stay with children for lifelong.
How do we respond in this situation? How difficult is it to get our support out there?
It is not easy. As I mentioned, Save the Children has been present in Ukraine since 2014. Basically, in the past 8 years, the conflict was there. Of course, it wasn't at the scale that we see now. But we worked in the eastern part of Ukraine, providing humanitarian assistance to the impacted communities. Our activities were related to the non-food items distribution, to provision of cash assistance to vulnerable families. We had lots of educational activities with children, including running safe spaces for children. But now, as we see the entire country is involved in the military operation, we've seen shelling in major cities of Ukraine. We are sharply expanding our response. If in the past we worked just across the so-called contact line between the governmental and non-governmental controlled area, we are now going to expand to the central part of Ukraine, setting up our presence in the west of the country because the needs are immense. it was very difficult to organize humanitarian assistance in early days. We had just a team of 25 staff in the beginning. So we are expanding now to almost 200 staff. We are expanding the number of our partners in the country from the 4 partners we had in the past now to more than 20 partners that will help and will be our extended hand to reach out the most vulnerable communities on the ground. We are setting up presence in different parts of the country, including the center, the western part, but we'll continue also providing humanitarian assistance in the eastern part of the country, which is most affected by the shelling and missile attacks, etc. As of today, we have already provided 1 million high energy biscuits for 44,000 families. That will help them to go for good 15 days. 450,000 hygiene kits are on their way to help the displaced population. We're providing clean water, 60,000 life-saving kits as well will be distributed to the health facilities. And then, of course, the big part of our operation will be related to multi-purpose cash assistance. We have to understand that while the overall number of children affected by this conflict is as high as 7.5 million children in the country, there were 4 million people who fled the country, but 6.5 million IDPs inside the country. And those IDPs, I believe, are in most difficult situation because they left their homes with almost nothing. And they are finding the place in temporary shelters, either staying in crowded communal centers, collective centers, or staying with their friends and relatives. And those conditions are not good for the families, let alone the psychological impact of displacement. So Save the Children will be not only providing the humanitarian assistance in forms of MFI, food distribution, kits for children like diapers, pampers, etc., but also providing psychosocial support to children, which is essential. We know that education is not operational in the country, so we have to start working with children so that they can somehow bear the impact of the atrocities they witnessed.
We are going to move on now to hear from Rachel Cummings. As I mentioned, she is the director of the Humanitarian Health Response Unit, and she is leading our team on the ground in Ukraine. So this is her message for us here in New Zealand and Australia.
Hello, New Zealand. My name is Rachel Cummings. I'm the director of the Humanitarian Public Health Team at Save the Children UK, and I'm currently working as the health lead for the Ukraine response for Save the Children. I've been in Ukraine now for around 2 weeks, and I've travelled from Lviv to Vinnytsia in central Ukraine, and then further east last week in Odessa, and then across to Mykolaiv. Save the Children are working here to support the children affected by the crisis, and this is a children's emergency. This is a child protection crisis that we're seeing unfold inside Ukraine. So far, Save the Children have distributed 230 tonnes of high-energy biscuits to children and their families. We've also collaborated with the Ministry of Health and partners to provide 60,000 trauma kits for first-line responders able to stabilise patients and move them to hospital and health facilities, mainly in the east of the country, where the major conflict lines are. Save the Children are deeply concerned about unaccompanied and separated children in this war. Before the crisis, there were 100,000 children living in institutions across Ukraine. Some of those children have been evacuated outside of Ukraine, but we are deeply concerned about the children remaining in institutions, mainly in the east. And children outside of institutions have also had their lives turned upside down. School has been disrupted. They've seen atrocities that no child should ever see. And they've witnessed their families being distraught and having to make extraordinary decisions and extraordinary journeys across Ukraine. Just last week when I was in Mykolaiv, I was able to spend time with some of the doctors in the children's hospital there. They'd evacuated 300 children that were receiving cancer care and complex medical care. Those children have now left Ukraine and are living in Europe, receiving care within Europe. And the hospital has now been repurposed as a children's emergency hospital. They had 70 patients, all of which had been affected by the conflict, having had trauma surgery. Some children had been involved in blast injuries, so very complex cases. But the extraordinary passion and compassion by the health facility staff and the doctors and nurses who continue to work. They'd set up a system where they moved the children downstairs into the bunkers when the air raid shelters went off. And the day before we visited, so last Wednesday, that hospital was attacked by shelling, and we saw and witnessed the remnants of that with the windows blown out. And some of the children in the facility had been traumatized and had sort of physical injuries from the attack, where 2 people died the day before we visited. So Save the Children will do all we can to support that hospital. So thank you, New Zealand. Thank you for your generosity, but also thank you for your solidarity and standing with the people of Ukraine and the children of Ukraine. And your generosity allows Save the Children to continue the work that we're doing to help the most vulnerable children in really an extraordinary crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Before we move on to some more questions with you, Irina, on our response in neighbouring countries, I'd just like to move to you, Heidi, for a moment to ask about our own appeal here in New Zealand, which has helped so immensely for children in Ukraine.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Irina, for sharing your story and your experiences with us. And I agree with you. You know, you can't watch these things and not get emotional. We've been overwhelmed with the response that we've seen here in New Zealand and Australia. And I'd like to take a moment just to acknowledge every one of you and for the impact that you are making. Without your contributions, this wouldn't be possible, and we are extremely humbled. Now, here in New Zealand, we've raised more than $1.2 million, which will go towards the response that Irina is talking about. And I'd like to particularly mention the Virtual Conqueror community, who were able to raise a massive $500,000 in just a week, which went towards our response as well as that of the Red Cross. Adam, June and the team, thank you again for this incredible gift and support to the children of the Ukraine. But we've also seen our communities support us. Schools have come on board. We've seen cooking challenges and art fundraisers for the cause. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Irina, we know that more than 4.3 million people, half of whom are children, have already fled across international borders. Many are hungry, alone, and facing freezing temperatures. Can you please tell us about some of the greatest risks these children are facing?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Amy. Indeed, there are a number of risks that these children are facing. First of all, we have to bear in mind that these children who cross the international borders are usually traveling without their fathers. because of the conscription process that is ongoing in Ukraine. So they have big worries about the part of their family which is not with them. So they travel with their mothers. There are many unaccompanied children, as some people try to escape their children, providing the seat in a car with the relatives or friends. And when these children become unaccompanied, they may face high risk of violation, of trafficking, let alone that all children who escaped from the violence and atrocities in Ukraine, they have a very tough psychological situation. Of course, they left everything they had before. They left behind their schools, their friends, their fathers, their relatives. So the emotional condition of these children is really difficult. In terms of the basic needs, Save the Children is trying to provide the assistance at the border, but we are also working quite actively in Poland, in Romania, and the children and their families who arrive to these countries. I think they are well taken care of. They are provided with very basics, with blankets, with warm clothes, with food, non-food items as well. Save the Children and its partners in Romania and in Poland are also organizing child-friendly spaces where children can come and play, forget for a few hours about the difficult times they witnessed back in Ukraine. And this is very important and proven methodology for Save the Children that have been applied everywhere. Family reunification is also one of the issues that Save the Children is working to provide the good scheme to the local communities and authorities on family tracing and reunification. This becomes really important. In addition to our response operations in Romania and in Poland, there are many refugee families who travel further to Europe. And there we have a big family of Save the Children members who are also providing assistance to the refugees. We have assistance programs in Italy, in Switzerland, Germany, Denmark, Finland, in all countries where we have presence of Save the Children. And one important message I would like to give you here, and kudos to all the partners that we have. We advocate for non-discriminatory approach dealing with refugee children and their families. So whichever family needs assistance, regardless of their nationality and visa status, should be provided the assistance they need.
Thank you, Irina. One of the questions that's come through is about the number of staff we have working in the response, both in Ukraine and in neighbouring countries. Do you have any idea how many staff we have in the field at the moment?
That's a good question. I mentioned in the beginning that prior to the conflict, we had just 25 staff, but we have sharply increased. Now, the number of our staff on the ground is almost around 100 staff, and we keep recruiting more. Apart from the staff, I mentioned already that we are expanding the number of partners, and these represent additional pairs of hands that will be supporting our humanitarian response. Our aim is to raise the number of staff to 150, 200. I'm saying with this threshold because we are still in the process of planning our operations on the ground. But a short answer would be we will increase the number of staff by 7-8 times. There is a need to also place the staff in different parts of the country, as our response will be covering much bigger territory than it was before. In terms of Poland and then the Romania staff, in Romania, we had our presence before the military operations in Ukraine started, and they had, I think, fully operational presence in Romania with 30 or 35 staff there, which is also increasing now at the level of volunteers also participating in the activities. Whereas in Poland, we have a number of staff representing Save the Children, but also actively working with partners. We have partners there who are supporting our operations on the ground.
And what about the way that we coordinate or cooperate with other NGOs such as Red Cross? Can you talk a little bit about that for us, Irina?
Well, Ukrainian Red Cross has become one of our partners, which is great news because they have really great experience across Ukraine, and they will be involved in our response operations. In terms of coordination, I have to say that UN has done a great job in Ukraine, coordinating all the activities and cluster responses in the country. Save the Children is present in education cluster, in child protection cluster. We're co-leading and providing all necessary information, trying to avoid any duplication of effort and ensure good coordination and information share. I have to add here that since in the past Save the Children was working in the eastern part of the country, we were in a way quite unique because not many international organizations had access to very eastern part of the country, and we count on our good experience record there, and we hope that we will be able to continue providing humanitarian response in the eastern part of the country.
These are extremely harrowing times, no doubt, for your teams working in the field right now. Are there also times when the teams have talked about that sense of achievement, or they've witnessed examples of beauty amongst such sadness? Is there anything you'd like to share here about that?
Yeah, for me, this is also a very emotional and amazing story about our staff. I have been in contact with the senior management team since the day one of operations, talking privately, talking as a team. What happened is the kick off the military operation saddened the staff in the locations they were at that moment. So we had staff based in the east, in Donetsk. We had staff based in the central part in Kiev as well. I recall a story, you know, on the eve of 24th of February, one of our staff was supposed to travel to join her husband abroad for vacation for just a few days. She left her two kids in town Slovyansk, and she was in Kiev when military operations started, and everything then was frozen. No train transportation, no flights, nothing. So for good 2 weeks, she was able to contact her children by phone, but imagine her emotional situation, knowing that the children are there with their grandmother and without having the possibility to hug them, to calm them down. You know, I think I was just struck with the resilience this woman and other staff of Save the Children in Ukraine demonstrated, despite this difficult emotional situation. And I know that each and every one on the team had their personal stories. you know, they had relatives in different parts of the country. They could see the media reports, that they could hear the shelling, the bombing, etc. Sometimes the communication was interrupted. These people didn't stop working for a single hour. Believe me, they worked 7/24 to ensure that they provide the necessary services for Save the Children to continue, for Save the Children to stand by children who need us in the country. So there are many stories like that. We still have our staff scattered in the country, but luckily we are able to supply more human resources to support them. I talked to the country director yesterday, and he said, I'm forcing my staff to take 1 day leave because for good 8 weeks, they were not able to take any time off and working really, really hard, despite all the difficulties in terms of their emotional situation.
I have a question here. How is COVID affecting your ability to respond? Is this impacting on hospitals as well as trauma?
Well, COVID has been on the rise even prior to the conflict. With the massive displacement as we see these days, and I'm sure people who watch the reports on media, they see that people are not wearing masks these days. I mean, the refugees and the IDPs, it's rare you will see people wearing masks or maintaining hygiene conditions. We are extremely worried about that. But the reality is, if we consider numerous families in the bomb shelters, for example, having no access to clean water to bath their children or to wash hands, I mean, this is the reality they face. We're trying to supply the hygiene items as much as we can, because this is also the way to prevent the widespread of COVID. I just hope that, you know, in situations like this, sometimes the immune system of people can do miracles. I really hope that their immune system will be able to sustain, and they will not have on the top of everything they bear these days, also increase of COVID spread in the country.
I've also got a question here from Henry in Australia, who is wondering about staff and volunteers, particularly, I imagine, after that story, Irina. How do they deal with what they see in terms of what sort of support is there for, like, psychological support or debriefings in order to help them cope with this every day? Oh, Irina, you're on mute.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. So for the newly hired staff and for our volunteers, there are a series of capacity building events that Save the Children is ensuring prior to let them work with children or approach children. This is the normal procedure for Save the Children, and we're ensuring that. And our staff and our volunteers have specific protocols to follow, which they do in terms of the hygiene, in terms of wash, etc. And they're trying their best to maintain these protocols when they work with children.
Before we move on to the next lot of questions with you, Irina, we're going to, you mentioned the child-friendly spaces, and we've got a story here of Irina, who is Russian but lived in Ukraine until recently. She fled with her children to Romania and spent some time in one of our child-friendly spaces that is set up, as Irina mentioned, to give children and their families some time to play recharge, and just be kids.
Здесь обустроили очень классную игровую палатку для детей. Мой средний сын, он почти весь день сегодня провел там. Ему очень нравится, он даже не хочет оттуда уходить. Там замечательные работают люди, он счастлив. А старший тоже познакомился там немножко с друзьями, теперь они вместе играют в салочки. Я очень рада, что мои дети даже в такой ситуации могут улыбаться. Я просто этому рада.
Thank you. It's really heartwarming to see some examples of real impact, and as Irina says, in that just having a bit of time for children to smile is something. So thank you, Irina, and Save the Children, your teams, for doing what you're doing, and thank you everyone for the support that you're giving to make this possible. I'm going to move on to some questions from some of our attendees. And then I'm conscious of time, as I know that you're pretty busy, Irina. So we'll just have a couple more questions from here, and then I will put a final question to both of you. What are some of the best ways for corporations to help save the children in Ukraine, other than monetary donations? Is there any best practices for private sector collaboration?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We are in the process of establishing humanitarian assistance, and of course, this is something that is required in the first days of emergency, especially as the military operation is not over. So we really call on all influencers around the globe to call on parties to stop the violence in Ukraine and stop the war. When it comes to partnering with private sector, I think this is so important to ensure post-military operation when there is an agreement signed to stop the hostilities and military operation, because the economy has suffered a lot. There is a destruction of enterprises, of communal system in the country. There will be a big need for restoration of the normal life, which includes services. It includes production facilities. It includes transportation and all other infrastructure. So everything will require an investment, excuse me, and support from businesses, from people of goodwill, to provide the assistance to the country to restore the normal operation and the normal life in Ukraine. Just to give an example, when we speak about schools, right, as of today, the Ministry of Education of Ukraine reported about 859 schools affected by the conflict. They were shelled. Of these, 776, I think, were damaged. The rest, meaning 83 schools, are completely destroyed. So where these children are going to go when the conflict is over? where they will get their education. The needs are massive. And I'm mentioning the educational facilities that are under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Education of Ukraine. We don't even know the impact on schools and education facilities in the eastern part of Ukraine. So the needs are so massive that I think the support coming from businesses, from people who want to help restore the normal life in Ukraine will be very much needed and very much appreciated.
Thank you. Due to the volumes of children and refugees involved and the need for volunteers and staff to help manage the work, how are we ensuring that children are safe from trafficking and harm?
Well, in the places where Save the Children works, I have already mentioned that we have special protocols that are applied for volunteers as well as for staff. These protocols are mandatory according to Save the Children's safeguarding policy, and every staff and every volunteer is supposed to pass a training, a rapid training, before they are allowed to get in contact with children. Plus, we have reporting mechanism in the event if parents or someone or children themselves have some complaints, they can apply to Save the Children staff, and this issue will be immediately picked up by our staff, and the response will be provided. Just as a one of examples of way of working for Save the Children, the child-friendly spaces that this Russian woman has mentioned in the video are run by several staff and volunteers, and there is never the case when one single person is staying with children. They are always working at least in pairs, if not more staff is present there. This is to ensure that children are safe and that there is no violence applied to those children by anyone.
Are governments friendly to Ukraine, providing humanitarian relief in insufficient quantities, do you think?
Say it again, sorry, I didn't copy the first part.
The question is, are governments friendly to Ukraine, providing humanitarian relief and in sufficient quantities?
I think so far, Ukraine has seen a lot of generous support by governments and by private individuals as well. I believe they are friendly. The very fact that the governments are accepting millions of refugees crossing international borders, they are providing huge amount of monetary support, other type of support to the refugees. They are helping them with the temporary visa, they are helping them with temporary employment, helping the children to get into mainstream education. So this can be only appreciated and commended for all the efforts the governments are doing.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I have one final question, Irina, and for you too, Heidi. I'd like to know, and I'll start with you, Heidi, what would you like to see for the children of Ukraine?
Thank you, Amy. You know, everywhere war is fought against children. And I'd like to see the same that I see for my children. A warm bed, a school to go to, a mum and a dad, or a mum and a mum, dad and a dad. When they get home, that there's someone there for them. They can play with friends that's on their street, their neighbours, go to their grandparents. It's a wish that every mum has, you know. I must say this has left me quite emotional tonight. It does make me think of Eglantine Jeb, our founder, and she said, humanity owes the child the best it has to give. And that's the challenge for all of us, is to give the children of the Ukraine the very best we can.
Thank you, Heidi. Irina, what would you like to see?
Yeah, thank you, Heidi. So well said. I certainly echo everything you said, Heidi. Every war is a war against children. Children suffer the most from the war, from the atrocities, from the violence they see. And as I said earlier, this may stay with them for years. Every time I hug my grandson, I'm thinking of children who are deprived from their parents at the moment, who are scared, who are terrified and traumatized. And I just hope that they are able to restore their belief in the future, that they are able to go back to join their friends, to play with them, to see their fathers, to see their homes, their toys, their pets that they love. So I really hope that this violence will end and that children will restore their lives.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for joining us. And thank you to all of you who have come along to be part of this webinar tonight. We'll just sign off now. And if we didn't get to your question, please, or if you have any others, email us. I think Kat is putting our email address into the chat for everyone, but it is info@savethechildren.org.nz, I think. And again, Irina, particularly, thank you for coming. I know how busy your schedule is, and we just appreciate it so very much. And best wishes to you and all the team in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And yeah, thank you for all the work you're doing. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, New Zealand. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.